if you just migrate one or two large shared drives, why not to take extra time to create a nice looking homepage for that site you migrate? Also, for larger migrations, you might want to consider things like custom metadata. You maybe search and again global navigation. You can potentially turn on multilingual support at a destination at certain sites. Also, you might consider turning up on DLP, retention policies, sensitivity labels. You might also need to create your target teams and sites in a specific geographic location. That's a multi-geo feature. It's a little advanced, but in some companies that's used to be compliant with some laws, especially in Europe. For medium and large migrations, I highly recommend having a migration mapping. This is so that you can keep track of what you're doing, where a certain drives goes. Some drives might need to be archived. You might not need to move everything. What if only out of 100 drives, you only need to migrate 2? So to decide that, you need to create a report, get a list of every drive shared or just Google Drive with its name, email, and a decision column. In the spreadsheet, you can create a decision column and give it options like migrate versus do not migrate versus archive. And in the same mapping file, ideally, you might need a column that has a URL of a target OneDrive user or a SharePoint site or a team that will get the files moved. Again, for smaller migrations, you might not need it. And again, most migrations are fairly simple. This is more advanced, but since I'm dealing mostly with complex migrations, this is what I do every time. Identity mapping, ShareGate is pretty good at automatically migrating file and folder level permissions and determining what the target user is that already had permissions at Google Workspace. However, you might need to do a test to see if ShareGate can determine this identity mapping. To do that, you can create a simple file or folder, assign to it a Google group, maybe 5 users, and then run a test migration and see how the file or folder level permissions are migrated. In some cases, in Microsoft 365, the identities like emails or UPNs change. For example, you used to have an account at Dennis M at contoso.com, and in M365, you might have an identity that's maybe sounds like Denis.Molotsov at contoso.com. So it's different. So in many cases, ShareGate can automatically figure it out. But in some cases, when your identities change quite a bit for some reason, you might need to do a test migration to see if this mapping can automatically be picked up. The same is true for groups. Google Workspace groups that are used for permission management, you might need to make sure you pre-create these groups, check if they already exist. If they don't exist, of course, create them. If you create them, make sure they're not empty. The groups you provision need to have members, and the members from the source Google Workspace need to match the membership of the target group, M365 or security group. How do you get the membership? This is where the inventory comes into play. So inventory is the key for complex migrations. If you have a simple migration, you might not need to worry about this. Just create a site or a team and manually go to owners, members, and just assign everyone you think needs permissions this way. One of my tips is, if you can, migrate as little data as possible. Oh, because the less you need to move, the less issues you'll have. Out of, let's say, 100 gigabytes or a terabyte, maybe you need only 5% of it to move. Perhaps it's out of date, maybe new versions of files were released and you just don't want to migrate junk. In many cases, you only need to migrate half or like 10%. But if you don't know what needs to be migrated, yep, you can just move everything and then figure it out later. But if you have some time and knowledge, uh, spend this time and decide what can be archived or deleted, or if you have this spreadsheet where you listed every single drive, if you have time, and this is not a simple migration, mark every drive in that spreadsheet as migrate, do not migrate, and so on, so that you know what's moved. Consider running test migrations, and these are important because you don't want to run a migration against 300 drives only to see a nasty surprise that maybe permissions didn't migrate because you forgot to check a checkbox to move migrations, or maybe you forgot to pre-create OneDrives, or there could be all sorts of things you want to test before you even start. So uh, do a test migration. You can do it on your own, but ideally, you want to do also a pilot migration. That means some real department or users need to be migrated. And for that, at least in my experience, it's frequently that the IT department or communications department volunteers to be a pilot group. What it means is that or all their drives and maybe shared drives are migrated first, then they help you to test it, see if something goes wrong. They can maybe, if it's a communications department, they are pretty good at telling you if you forgot to communicate something. For example, you have a draft email you will send to everyone in the organization that have an instruction listing what you need to do as a user before the migration, during the migration, and after. And as a member of a communications team, I read it and I try to follow, but the steps maybe don't make sense. So they will tell you, they will help you to craft the messages. Not everyone who runs the migration is good at communications, so you can partner with this department so that you can both use their own strengths. During the test migration, basically you want to migrate one or two or three drives, and after the migration, you might need to check how, if every file is migrated, if file level permissions are migrated. Check how fast the migration goes, because you need to know and predict approximately how the full migration will take. What if you realize that your migration takes a month of just sitting and waiting for ShareGate to move everything? This is, if you know this, if you know that the migration will take too long, consider, this is when you can consider setting up more than one migration workstation. So do a test migration at the very least to learn the speed and just catch as many issues ahead of time. In many cases, the migrations go well, but you don't want to risk it and just run the full-blown migration without testing. For large migrations, when you need to migrate hundreds or thousands of drives, I recommend using a great ShareGate PowerShell module. This module uh, um, is automatically provisioned when you install ShareGate. So if you just use PowerShell ISE or maybe Visual Studio Code, whatever you prefer, you can take advantage of that PowerShell module to connect to the source Google Workspaces and to each drive separately and to the target destination tenant. This is a very basic example that connects to one shared drive and to the target site. In reality, if you have to migrate 1,000 drives, you would need a kind of a for each loop that connects to 1,000 drives and to 1,000 sites or OneDrives. But the basic sample is still going to work. Of course, in the more advanced scenario, you'll have a few more parameters to pass. But again, this is just a simple uh, snippet of a code that gives you an idea of how PowerShell migration is supposed to work. Final migration and cutover. So the final migration should be planned. You might need to pick maybe a weekend or maybe an entire week. And you need to let everyone know that at a certain date, users need to maybe stop uploading files at the source location, stop editing anything. And that will give you less kind of pain later on when you need to run delta migrations or incremental migrations.